This is George Bugh. It's been about 8 years since I did anything with this stuff. I saw on YouTube where someone said they'd like to see more, and so I came across his old presentation, PowerPoint presentation, so I'm converting it to a video, and I apologize if it doesn't really explain enough. Hopefully it's better than nothing, and I'll try and talk a little to each slide unless it starts taking too long. This is all based on the difference between quantum electrodynamics and classical electrodynamics, and my contention is that after 7 years of research, it looked to me like everything, the quantum behavior of subatomic particles can be explained by interactions that are all understandable using classical electrodynamics. And a big part of that is spin interactions and spin waves, not just among uncompensated spins, but among paired electrons in atoms and radiated and received electromagnetic energy among all subatomic particles from their spin motions. This slide just gives a kind of a classical explanation of the electron. It's not blue, it's not a ball, it's just a symbolic representation. It has spin, and because of its spin, the spin motion of that energy, you might consider it the Poynting vector. It's at right angles to the direction of the magnetic field and the electric field. That motion is what causes the development of the magnetic dipole through the electron, and that's its spin axis that it goes through. Just like a gyroscope, if you've got some force, in this case a magnetic force pushing and pulling on that spin axis, it won't just turn directly to face or turn away from that external force, but it'll start gyrating around like a gyroscope or a top that's off axis. And as it does so, it will radiate away electromagnetic waves, according to classical electrodynamics. In quantum electrodynamics, they contend that down at the subatomic level, the classical behavior of an electron can no longer apply, because if it did, it would radiate away all its energy in the form of electromagnetic waves. And it's my contention that that's correct. It does radiate away its energy. However, it does receive energy from all other radiating similar particles. So the energy is maintained, and it also causes the development of standing waves among all matter, kind of like a three-dimensional weave of the fabric of space. And in fact, it's that standing wave energy that in a very convoluted way gets explained by quantum physics as zero-point energy. If you go to the website down there that lists at the bottom, Hyperphysics, gsu.education base spin.html, you'll see more explanation of this diagram on this slide. In quantum physics, they say spin is either up or down, even though their diagram shows that it's just a portion of its magnetic field that's up or down. And when considering exchange energy between particles, they still acknowledge a kind of a precession, even though they say the classical idea of precession can't be applied. But in fact, they use it in equations explaining how particle interactions occur. In classical electrodynamics, classical view of an electron, the spin axis is not just up or down. In quantum physics, they say that's true, but in fact it's the precession angle that they call precession axis that they call the spin axis, when in fact the spin axis is at an angle and off to the side and continuously precessing about a precession axis. and that motion causes radiation of electromagnetic waves, and it also in the process of precessing can be absorbing electromagnetic waves from other similar particles. And I'll just let you read this. It kind of says what I've been saying. If some of these slides go by too fast, feel free to just push the pause button on YouTube and take your time and read it more slowly. This sea of standing waves creates an interaction among all matter that Ernst Mach alluded to as necessary to cause matter's characteristic of inertia. A lot of people don't know that Einstein studied Mach's ideas, and this one in particular is called Mach's principle, or sometimes people call it Mach's conjecture. And it's basically saying that what we call inertia can't exist just on a piece of mass all by itself, but it only exists in relation of that mass in relation to all the rest of the mass in the universe. And the way he states that, it implies that there must be some kind of interaction, energy interaction between one piece of matter and all the rest of the matter of the universe. And so my contention is that interaction is in fact that sea of standing waves. When a particle or a group of particles making up an object is tried to force to a new position in space, as soon as you start changing its position, the precessional motions of every subatomic particle within that mass starts getting out of phase with all the electromagnetic energy radiating towards it from everything else, from those standing waves. And that those magnetic forces that develop cause you to feel resistance. Just like if you're trying to take a north magnet and push it against the north of another magnet, it takes force to push those two norths together. So as soon as you start getting a phase difference between one group of precessing particles and the signals coming from all other, then that phase difference causes you to get more and more as if you're like a north pushing towards the north. And that's a lot easier to see with some animations. It's hard to describe in words. But those forces trying to move something to a new position actually cause rotations, the precessions of all the particles to have to resync in what is then in phase for its new velocity in some direction. Another aspect that this last bullet at the bottom's trying to describe is when you have, for example, paired electrons in orbitals around an atom, you can have upspin and downspin, kind of like is described in quantum physics. But really what's happening is you have classical spin, classical precession, and those precessing magnetic dipoles radiate away electromagnetic waves in which, because of the way they're polarized with respect to each other, the electric fields end up being equal and opposite. However, the magnetic fields are the same polarity, so they add. So you end up with like an AC signal that's purely magnetic. And again, that's hard to show. It's hard to explain just words. It's something I need animations to explain. There's some diagrams in the book that was out 8 years ago before the DoD asked me to keep quiet. But I don't have anything now. And just for the record, the DoD didn't say they wanted me to stay quiet because they want this technology to be quiet. The official direction from the DoD is they don't want the public to know my name and start calling me up and asking me about classified projects I work on, even though this was unrelated to what I was working on. And I got permission from my defense contractor to publish this information. They had their experts look at it, and they didn't understand what I was talking about. So they said, sure, go ahead and publish your research papers. And then later the DOD didn't care that I had that permission. They just said, well, we don't want anyone to know who you are and be talking to you. Okay, I got off subject there. Anyway, you can pause this and read these slides, absorb it a little more. This is kind of a two-dimensional representation of a spin wave, and this is a representation of uncompensated spins like you'd have in a magnetic material. But most of this technology advancement that's possible that I'm trying to describe is something having to do with spin waves among paired electrons, for example, or compensated spins. You can't easily measure it, and according to Occam's razor, you're supposed to just forget that it exists. But in fact, it is still there, and there are spin waves capable of propagating out throughout the whole universe, creating this sea of standing waves, even though it's not easily detected. According to the classical model of how things should interact, there should be this sea of standing waves and not perfect harmony within those standing waves, so you'll have ripples of spin waves, of variations all the time going out through these paired radiations in which you end up with just ripples of very high frequency magnetic field changes without an accompanied electric field component. And it's kind of obscure in these slides, but you end up, when you're radiating out from centers of mass from these pairs of waves, it ends up making a very slight attractive force towards centers of convergence of matter. In other words, I'm making another conjecture that what we call gravity is in fact the result of the attractive force from these waves of very high frequency magnetic waves radiating out from mass that all tends to synchronize with each other. There's two basic forms of motion of all electrically charged particles. Most of our technology today is based on rectilinear motion of charged particles, and so basically what I'm saying is even whether it's an uncompensated spin or compensated spin, you can still develop technology that utilizes changing spin axis orientations, and the electromagnetic waves radiated out to and from them, and base technology on manipulating that to do lots of cool stuff. Signal processing is one thing. Communications is another. I'll just skip to the last bullet. Communications of the future may use spread spectrum spin wave receivers and transmitters. And again, I'm talking about not just radiation from uncompensated spins, but in other words, spin wave ripples that spread out among the otherwise more in harmony or more in sync sea of standing waves. You've got standing waves, three-dimensional standing waves throughout the universe that's already there, and then you cause kind of a ripple among those where they temporarily shift phase and then go back in phase again. And that's what a spin wave is a temporary change in the phase of motion. This is describing how this can be used for power generation, and in fact that's how my 7 years of research on all this started, is studying devices that output electrical energy from no apparent source, and in the process of trying to figure out, well, what is the source, that's how I came up with all this other stuff. And this is just one device I theorized should work as just another typical, quote, free energy electromagnetic device. I started building it and I never finished because the legal department at my company made sure I understood that if it worked, it would be their property, even if I built it on my own time. So I never finished the thing. I prefer just to publish information about it since they gave me permission to do that. And this is an example of a propulsion system. That and the previous slide are both based on the same kind of idea, where at very high frequency, Lenz's law doesn't apply the same anymore. If you have an EMF, it goes out and reflects off something that's due to the induced current flow. That induced current flow causes a counter EMF, and once it gets back to the source that caused it, normally, according to Lenz's law, it would provide a counter force, and that's how energy gets converted in motors and things like that, generators, from the force applied to electrical energy output. But if you have very, very high frequency feedback, it ends up coming back and applying a force that reinforces the initial signal rather than counteracting it. And that, in fact, should cause the subatomic particles that make up that system to start shifting in their spin, so they're slightly out of sync with the sea of standing waves. And it's that out of sync condition that allows these electromagnetic devices to start producing electrical energy from no apparent source. So shifting all the magnetic spins, also the more you shift them out of phase with like all the synced up spins radiating from the Earth, makes them less and less susceptible to the gravitational pull that those spins are causing. So either you can shift phase, and like if you've got 180 degrees out of phase, it cause a push instead of a pull, or you can just shift to totally different frequency, in which case you don't feel any push or pull from gravity because you're not in sync with it, or 180 out of sync with it anymore. And these are just suggestions I had 8 years ago of what kind of research people could do to study all this kind of stuff further. I don't have it in the slides, but I should mention that I saw a fairly close correlation between some of the things Bob Lazar said about how the propulsion systems worked that he was researching, and this research that I did. Not 100% correlation, but a close correlation. I started wondering if some of the people we worked with were deliberately feeding him information that was close but actually not correct, as a way of putting people off who were actually trying to understand it all by listening to Bob Lazar. And all of this stuff is explained in the book I came out with 8 years ago. There's things in it that are not correct now. I see, hopefully not much of it, but there are things, if I ever come out with another publication, I'll try to make some corrections. But for now, it looks like the DoD doesn't want me to do any of that. So the basic benefits of Spinwave technology are we don't need to cause global warming anymore. We can use energy sources primarily, or basically I'm saying non-petroleum, non-fossil fuel energy sources that would not cause global heat anymore. And in fact, characteristics of a lot of these devices is they get cold during operation. So to a small extent anyway, their operation would be reversing global warming. The technology can be used to improve transportation and communications. Spinwave technology makes it easier to explore space, using it for propulsion systems, and for communication, it allows us to communicate with our neighbors. Basically, that means I'm contending that probably people in other solar systems around us None of them use rectilinear motion of charged particles for communication. They probably all figured out the spinwave stuff, and that's why we don't ever see any signals in any of these SETI projects trying to pick up signals from outer space. They probably don't do it this kind of a prehistoric way that we came up with. And this is just telling you where this all started for me, is when I, in my boredom after my work, spent a lot of my time studying a lot of these unusual, anomalous power-producing devices. And this is maybe 8 years ago is when I finished, so it was 15 years ago when I kind of started all of my research. There's tons more misinformation out on the internet now. During that 7-year period, close to the end of it, is just an interesting thing I'm recalling. I got a phone call inside my company. I can tell because when we get an outside call, it rings twice with each ring. When we get an inside call, it rings once each ring. So I get a call that's ringing once each ring, and the guy's telling me I work in another department at my company, and we're under government contract to track down everybody in the world who's coming up with these things. And we see your internet activity and see some of the things that you've put out there in the news groups asking questions, and we want to know, do you want to join us and help us track down everybody in the world who comes up with these things? And I kind of told them politely, no thanks, and kind of surprised I never heard back from them since. And I wonder sometimes if they're just kind of being lazy about it and they don't really look up too much information, because all they have to do is secretly keep monitoring what I'm finding out. But that's just another unbased conjecture. And this is just a little bit about me. I grew up on a small ranch in the hill country near Austin, Texas. My dad was in the Air Force. He retired when I was 4, and that's when we moved to Austin. He was in Air Force OSI. He's a director for a while, and then he went to work at the Pentagon. He worked directly under the general in charge of all the OSI. But he didn't work on a lot of top secret projects. He did kind of boring stuff like manage the budget for improving the railway systems in Alaska, because they wanted access to their radar stations and that kind of thing. And he was involved in covert activities trying to find commie infiltrators during the Cold War who might try to sabotage our SAC air bases in the United States. So, never heard any stories from my dad about any kind of top secret projects anywhere close to this stuff. Anyway, after I got out of the Air Force, I went to college 4 years, and then I went to work right out of college for this defense contractor who I'm still with now. And I'm still there today, even 8 years after making the slide presentation. Been there 28 years now. And right about the time I made this slide presentation is when I got married. And 8 years later now I'm married still and got a couple of young kids. And that's all about me.